With tensions between Iran and Israel continuing to escalate, what might this mean for the broader region and how could it impact the Indo-Pacific? Now, to help us better understand these developments, we're joined by Don McLain Gill, a lecturer at DLSU's Department of International Studies. Don, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. Good morning.
All right, Don, let's start off. We all know that Israel and Iran have had their conflict and also with the U.S., but we never expected it to reach to this point. Now, how do you assess the overall impact of the U.S. bombing on Iran?
Well, there are several implications for this. Well, first of all, the complex operations successfully carried out by the U.S. Have illustrated its unrivaled military capabilities. However, I would be surprised if Iran would take this sitting down and negotiate immediately with President Trump, similar to what took place during the Iran-Iraq war. And as you've rightfully mentioned earlier, there were already strikes headed towards Israel. So regime survival is the most vital aspect in Iran's current political dynamics. For the short term, to ensure continuity, Ayatollah Khamenei's legacy, he has already made plans for his potential successors, and he has immediately replaced all targeted officials of Iran with new ones. But for the midterm to the long term, despite saying that they would resume their nuclear program, it wouldn't be that easy given the devastating damages. Nevertheless, with its back against the wall, it is aware, of course, that with the survival of its regime at stake, it may pursue irrational measures that may lead to the detriment of the region. And there are a couple of options that we could look at here. One is choking out the Strait of Hormuz, which carries out at least 20% of global crude trade, but that would also be counterproductive for Iran. Next couple of options would center on the fact that the Iranian missiles, or rather U.S. bases in the Middle East, are within the reach of Iran missiles. So one option would be to target U.S. bases in Iraq, because Iraq's security is the least comprehensive compared to the other Arab nations, and of course with its proxy dynamics. The other options would be more critical and would provoke a wider escalation with the U.S. That would be targeting the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, and of course the CENTCOM in Qatar. But this would of course involve deeper problems for the United States, would entangle it deeper, and of course would have serious implications for the Indo-Pacific.
Don, before we move on to the other questions, I'd like just to ask you something in related to what you said. Do you see this, the tensions escalating from an Israel and Iran conflict into a possible U.S. and Iran conflict similar to that of U.S. and Iraq?
Well, as I've mentioned earlier, it would depend on the degree of Iran's retaliation, if it would retaliate based on that. And as I mentioned, with regime survival at its most critical juncture in Iran today, it may result to irrational moves. And one of them would be targeting U.S. bases and military facilities across the Middle East. And that would, in fact, be seen by Washington as an act of war. And that may also eventually include certain Arab nations that would want to nevertheless remain neutral in the conflict. So that could, in fact, widen it further if that is eventually the way Iran takes it.
But for me, I would like to get your insights on what could probably what's at stake here for the Philippines. Should we remain neutral?
Well, here's the thing. For the Philippines, we have several implications. Obviously, our foreign policy dictates that we stand by international law. But there are wider implications that the Philippines must consider, and that is eventually the role of the United States as a security of the Indo-Pacific. Now, Mr. Donald Trump's first and second presidential campaign promises were based on breaking the chain of U.S. military interventions in the Middle East. And what occurred recently shows that an exit for the U.S. is in fact more difficult than it seems. So remember, America's entanglements in wars in Afghanistan and Iraq paved the way for China's assertive rise in the Western Pacific. China today is much more influential, economically developed,
Yeah.
and of course, militarily strong. So China's threat towards Taiwan is greater than ever, bearing in mind the Davidson window. And at the same time, it has also been ramping up provocations against the Philippines, against Japan. So Iran, for all its clear insecurity, and of course, the insecurity it brings out, of course, a nuclear armed Iran would be critical to the security of the region. It is not a rising great power, and its ambitions are localized
Yes.
compared to China. So the challenge now is for Washington not to be pulled into the brewing Middle East conflict, and of course, to proactively shape the terms of its withdrawal to better focus on the Indo-Pacific.
Don, if given who the president of the United States is and how volatile he is, if this is not handled properly, what would be the effect on the positioning here in Asia, given that there is also a conflict of our own between your mentioned Taiwan, China, and the Philippines? Will this affect now how the nations in Asia approach our own conflict with China? Do you see China maybe dabbling into this conflict?
Well, every time the U.S. is involved, or at least in certain degrees involved in other wars or conflicts in different parts of the world, it's China that continues to benefit, whether it be the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and of course the initial wars in the early 2000s in the Middle East and in Afghanistan, and potentially this one if it continues to draw the U.S. in. So in this regard, of course, this would play to the benefit of China. And of course, China is also a significant contributor to the development and support of Iran. And of course, that would continue to create more linkages between what Iran may eventually do and, of course, China, given the free hand in the Indo-Pacific. So that, that is a clear causal impact.
But wouldn't China see this also as a possible threat to their part, given that this could trigger, the defense treaty between the Philippines and the U.S.? If China dabbles in this issue, then we are quite near to the Middle East, nearer than the United States. Positioning-wise, they could use our bases. Likewise, we scratch the U.S. backs, they scratch our backs. Could something like that be happen? We'll help you with China, you help us with Iran.
Well, that really depends on what the implications would be, because obviously, as we can see, China has the quantitative advantage, at least. It has a geographical advantage here. And that would require more presence of the United States in this part of the world. And of course, and I think history speaks for itself. You cannot extinguish every fire in the region or every fire in the world, because you would have to eventually have to prioritize certain ones with global implications. And I think that is what is clearly seen with the challenge that China poses. Regarding our position, of course, we are located strategically in the first island chain.
Right.
We are also diversifying our options. We are working closely with Japan, and we are also working closely with other partners in the region. But at the same time, the role of the United States remains detrimental to the stability of the Indo-Pacific, and that has led to concerns as well among other Southeast Asian countries regarding where the future of the Indo-Pacific would lie, based on what would happen perhaps in the next couple of days.
But let's talk about the economic implications of this conflict. How vulnerable are Indo-Pacific economies to oil supply shocks if the conflict escalates further?
Well, clearly, energy prices are already taking a hit, and of course, if this continues to exacerbate, we could expect more of a critical energy crisis, much more, I'd like to say, than what initially took place during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, given, of course, that the Middle East is, in fact, the lifeline. And, of course, we talked about the Strait of Hormuz. It's merely 21 nautical miles. It's a narrow strait, but it carries a significant percentage of the energy security interests of countries, along with, of course, the natural gas exports from Qatar. Iran sits on top of the Strait of Hormuz, and Oman and the UAE sit below. So if in that instance there are further detriments in the free flow of goods and trade in these narrow passages, given that it connects itself to the Arabian Gulf, and the Persian Gulf, and the Gulf of Oman, leading to the Arabian Sea. And for us in the Western Pacific, it has to pass through the Strait of Malacca
Yeah.
and in the greater South China Sea. And if that is disrupted, and you already have ships trying to relocate and reroute their passages, that would also increase the cost for us. And then given the Philippines is a net importer,
Yeah.
that would of course be problematic for us, especially as our natural energy resources are depleting by the day.
Don, I'd like to move the conversation a little bit to another major player in the Asian region, North Korea. Should we be taking a close look at how they will posture? Well, we all know they're very critical of the United States, but we also have to remember President Donald Trump has had interaction already with the leader of North Korea.
Yeah, sure. You're talking about that under Trump 1.0,
Yeah.
but a lot has changed since then. And in fact, that sort of approach has not really yielded in anything substantial when it comes to the peace of the Korean Peninsula, but rather you see North Korea with its saber rattling. It just recently launched
Yeah.
missiles as well. And it is clearly watching. It is clearly watching, and it sees itself as being the possessor of nuclear weapons, that it has the advantage compared to, let's say, Iran, which was seen to be developing nuclear weapons. And of course, the actions taken by the US and Israel were to refrain it from completing the process, which would be critical to the region. But of course, with North Korea already possessing nuclear weapons, it may see this as an advantage that it possesses, and that could in fact embolden it to take more irrational steps in the region. So this is what I was saying, and this is the nexus that is forming in the Indo-Pacific. You have China on the one hand, you have North Korea, and eventually China has also been bringing in Russia, which is also clearly critical to Japan's exclusive economic zone and airspace. And eventually that could create more complexities in the Indo-Pacific with this nexus forming. So we'd have to at least address this at par with an equally robust deterrence. And that would only be appropriate or that would only be operationalized with a consistent approach towards the region.
Yeah. So what we are seeing right now is probably a retaliatory cycle, right? In your view, what could be the possible factors that these both sides will go back to the table and talk about negotiations?
Well, that is initially what the plan was, to make Iran feel the cost and to realize that the only way forward would be to get to the negotiating table, similar to what happened towards the end of the 8-year war between Iran and Iraq. But then again, as I mentioned, regime survival plays a huge role today, especially in Iran. And being backed against the corner, it may result to more assertive maneuvers and responses that may further deepen the crisis in the region. So, there are two schools of thought here. One is by defanging Iran, it would become less of a threat and it would eventually have to submit to negotiations. But on the other hand, it would make it more, it would force it to accentuate towards a harder hand in terms of its responses in the region. So there are two schools of thought regarding this, and the only way for us to find out is to see how this plays out in the next few days. Because as far as we can tell right now, all we can do is speculate.
Right.
But definitely, these are the two scenarios that may eventually fold out. And based on what happens, that would also have significant implications to us here in the region in the Indo-Pacific.
But with how this situation is unfolding, do you also see a possible rise of on terrorism, proxy wars in different countries?
Well, that's a given for sure. I mean, Iran has control over several proxy groups across Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, and it would definitely maximize its leverage over them. And in fact, that you could even expect or may expect targetings towards U.S. Diplomats, perhaps, or Israeli diplomats, or military officials of the U.S. stationed in different parts of the region. Most likely, there would be more attacks in Iraq, given that it is less defended. It has a less formidable defense posture compared to, let's say, Qatar or Bahrain or Saudi. But then again, Iran would use all these instruments to its advantage and eventually may spill over in other parts of the world.
Don, do you see this conflict, well, whether it reaches its boiling point or not, do you see this causing instability in the Asian region in terms of how other countries would like to do trade? I mean, we all know Iran has an aging army and they would not want to go head to head with the US. And you were talking about proxy wars or pocket resistance or pocket attacks, however you may call it. Do you see instability happening because of this apprehensions most countries will have, how Iran will reply?
Well, clearly, I mean, we have been facing a lot of instability even before this particular development, and that has made the international system today even more turbulent than how it was decades ago. And this is, of course, one factor that would add to the already critical security dynamics of the broader international system. So definitely, countries, especially less powerful countries, are now trying to compute and trying to quantify what options they have. Of course, it would be a sensitive issue when it comes to how they intend to balance their security interests, their economic interests, and given, of course, the polarization of power in a region makes it an even more difficult decision to make. But nonetheless, of course, the most important part is to ensure survival in a very turbulent international political scene and to prepare. And that is, I think, the best way to go, to prepare for the uncertainties that are to be likely unfolded in the days, weeks, months, years to come.
But given with what you said about China making this or seeing this as an opportunity to push its claim on the West Philippine Sea, do you see any increase in military or naval activity in the Indo-Pacific region? And would the U.S. help us right now, given that they're clearly occupied with what's happening between Iran and Israel?
Yeah, so that was exactly what we were trying to point out earlier, is that when we look at the situation right now, given China's geographical advantage, we have clearly seen that it has been increasing its assertive and belligerent presence operations throughout the first island chain and even parts of the Western Indian Ocean. And this is, of course, part of its two-ocean strategy, when it has operationalized since 2008. Now, this would be the test for U.S. security commitments in the region, and it would be, of course, also a test for how the U.S. will be able to maintain its posture in the region, of course, given the constraints and resources and diplomatic capital in some parts, especially with what has taken place in the Middle East. Certain Southeast Asian countries have been viewing the U.S. in a more negative light, and that would, of course, decrease its diplomatic prowess. You know, how the U.S. would eventually try to make this or to address this and at the same time maintain a robust posture would be seen in the months to come. But of course, as far as we're concerned in the Philippines, we still remain actively engaged with our American counterparts. And of course, the whole aspect of the alliance commitments are still very much there. But of course, with loopholes in terms of, in terms of the commitment and the consistency, rather, that becomes a challenge eventually.
All right, with that, thank you for your insights, Professor Don McLain Gill, Indo-Pacific Research Fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Thank you so much for your time.
Very much.